Mahinder Singh. Director Bhai Veer Singh on issues which have produced tragedies for the people. I welcome Mark, a well-known Punjab watcher and a distinguished social scientist, to deliver the keynote address on a subject which required serious intellectual deliberations. For me, as a student of human behavior, the topic violence, how violence ended in Punjab, appears to be slightly problematic. The topic itself is pregnated with a number of assumptions. Question which form of violence has in it suggests that the main focus of President how the processes,
some disturbance
how,
somewhere. This
to analyze the processes which has led to a particular form of violence. Hello. I that if looking for the answer to the question, violence, if at all, it is that in detail. This topic also assumes that focus would be on manifest form of violence, and it can be safely inferred and observed that had the deadlier politics and Sikh genocide not been unleashed, manifest form of violence may have been petered out in 1985 itself. So it may not examine the structural form of violence which largely remains latent. So, is it audible?
There's some problem with the band network, bandwidth is low, they say.
Okay.
Oh, at this stage, you can't do anything.
Speak a little loudly.
Fine.
Okay,
nothing wrong with your voice.
So,
something wrong with the service.
Okay. So for me, the assumption is that killing of terrorists and punishing a few policemen will result in the elimination of terrorism. There are lessons to be learned. Terrorism shall thrive if it is fought by harboring it. This is precisely what is being done. So my hope that the presentation of Mark shall not confine to the dominant form-centric approach, focusing only on a particular form of violence, because a form-centric approach suffers from a number of theoretical inadequacies and methodological infirmities. It focuses on actors rather than on causal interlinkages. The analysis remains descriptive, unable to factor theories of change. The form-directed analysis that isolate the conditions of environment and the interlinkages to the specific problem cannot uncover the causes of the phenomena. It is only limited to justifications and cultural perception related to the form. The actors may often formulate their own justification. Normally, we interview militants and policemen and others. So for me, that these kind of interviews they have their own justification. So as a defensive importance and tend to obscure rather than reveal the real motives and intentions. Let me make finally 3 observations, positional observations. For me, number 1, the return of peace in Punjab does not imply that the conditions which caused violence have been moderated, subsumed, or resolved. As is well known, peace is not absence of violence, but absence of those conditions which have given birth to it. My first positional observation. My second positional observation is that there are the conditions which are priority to the basic causes are historically evolved, like competing identities in Punjab, religious, communal, fundamentalist, secular Punjabi identities. So therefore, any analysis of violence or terrorism or other forms of protest has to be located in these competing identities. My third positional observation, which metaphorically speaking, there are 3 Punjabs: the Indian Punjab, the Pakistan Punjab, and diasporic Punjab. all have to be factored in. If you don't do that, you will not be able to analyze the absence or presence of violence in any sense. To conclude, this form-centric of violence becomes a truncated object of study because it confined itself to state and non-state actors, preclude the need to understand violence as a part of historical process. This conceptual error is a logical outcome of the assumption that terrorism is a result of the state trying to control violence by the non-actors, and the non-actors use violence to register their claims and consider the state as a repository of violence. So, to only when we analyze these forms, I'm sure Mark would A, analyze the reasons, justifications, manifestations of violence. B, to make an assessment of the nature, character, and longevity of peace in Punjab, whatever peace it exists, and suggest an alternate approach to understand and counter violence. I'm sure Mark will provide answers to some of these questions to build peace in future in Punjab. I invite now Mark to start his presentation. He'll get 30 minutes, and then we proceed with other discussants. Professor Puri and
give me a minute to welcome you all. We all know each other, but there's an audience from home and abroad who are joining, and maybe they've heard about Mark, but they may not have known about his works. So please permit me to welcome Professor Mark Juergensmeyer. I knew him through his works. First read his book, Sikh Studies, 1978. Then he invited Professor Singh to deliver Berkeley lecture on Sikhism. In 87, it was his initiative introducing first Sikh Studies conference in University of Toronto. And then it is Mark's initiative which led to the first chair of Sikh Studies in Santa Barbara. So we remain grateful to him for promoting Sikh Studies in a very secular, very objective manner. Now, Professor Harish Puri is a senior scholar, and I'm fortunate when I started my teaching career, he was there in Bering College. I read somewhere, you don't need to have 50 friends. You should have one friend who's there with you for 50 years. And he remains my friend for 55 years, though he has graduated to be my family elder, but he continues to be friend and family elder. Now, Jagrup Sekhon, we know through his writings, again, professor of political science in Guru Nanak Dev University. And it's a very strange coincidence. All the panelists, as well as the chair and the speaker, main speaker, they all been dealing with violence. And often we had the chance, Pramod would know, with Rashpal, Marot and others who used to meet the authorities that mattered. Almost it seemed that we have solved the problems. But political interest doesn't solve the problems. I wish we learn from our mistakes so that this is the way things are developing these days, this is causing me worry. Same things is almost happening. And Professor Kumar made very nice observations. As political interests of the parties, they don't want peace. Intellectuals want peace. They work for peace. Let us hope wisdom prevails somewhere. With these words, I welcome you all and also the audience which has joined us from different parts of India and abroad. Welcome. Now over to Mark. Yes, Mark.
Thank you very much, Mohinder. And it's a pleasure to be at the Bhai Singh Sahitya Sadan, at least virtually, if not in person, as I have on several occasions. But I can imagine being there. And it's nice to be with old friends, not just you, but also Harish and Jagrup, for a topic that all of us have opinions about. And I'm eager to learn from you, to hear your comments, which I know will be candid because I've had these candid conversations already with my friends. And so I'm looking forward to the discussion. So let me bring up a few slides on the topic that will help me make my point. My topic is on how the Punjab violence came to an end. And I should say it's a part of a larger project where I looked at several cases of movements that, in a very loose sense, could be described under the category of religious-related violence. And what I was trying to do is to see, do a comparative study in order to see what aspects of the ending of these movements were consistent. I mean, over the last 30 years, I've done a whole series of books on the rise of religious-related violence in different parts of the world. And at this point in my career, I wanted to do a study of how they came to an end, try to understand what were the factors that conduced to the movements coming to an end, and were there any consistent themes across all of these different cases. But at the outset, I should clarify a couple points. And the first one is the use of the word religion. Some years ago, Harish said, "Why are you talking about the uprising in the Punjab as religious? Religion had nothing to do with it." And I assured him he was right, that it all depends on what you mean by religion. Because as you know, religion can mean different things. In Punjab and in Hindi, there are good words for it. It could be mazhab, it could be dharm, it could be panth, it could be qaum. But it certainly isn't mazhab. It's not a matter of religious beliefs and this or that people are fighting for. It's more religion in the sense of qaum, that is a community, people fighting for a community that in a loose way has religion as a part of its descriptor. And I think it becomes obvious to anyone from the outside that when you're talking about a movement that's composed largely of Jat Sikh young men, that the religion and the community of which they're part is a part of the social cohesion for which they're fighting. So I don't want to get into the trap of saying you think religion causes violence. I don't think religion causes violence. That's not the point I'm making. And maybe the term religion isn't the right one to use, but it is a social identity that's labeled for people for whom their grievances are really, as Harish pointed out many years ago, nothing to do with religion. I mean, a lot of people with whom I've talked said they were first engaged in the struggle because of the issue of water rights. And I think for young Jat Sikh men in rural Punjab, to see their economic situation decline relative, particularly to urban countries and other groups, as the urban economies in India have grown, the rural ones seem to have stagnated. And so there's no question that the Jat Sikh men are concerned about their future. They see it in some ways declining. So there are legitimate economic, political, social grievances behind the movement, and you could probably add to these, which have nothing to do with Muslim, has nothing to do with religious beliefs, but in some sense, the movement can be defined that way. And this is actually true of movements around the world that I've looked at, including ISIS in Iraq and Syria. We often think of this as a violent religious movement, but most of the people who supported it were Sunni Arabs who felt left out of the politics of both Syria and Iraq, where the Shia-related governments were in control. And so for them, it was a matter of an empowerment of a social identity that animated most people who were involved in that struggle. And also true of another movement that I studied, the Moros in the Philippines. Again, they were fighting for Islam in any kind of narrow sense. They were fighting for their identity of a social group that they felt had been left out of the Philippine political life. So I don't want us to get hung up on the term religion. And if it bothers you, forget about it. Let's just talk about the uprising in the Punjab. And that leads me to another definitional issue. What are we talking about when we're talking about a war or a struggle in fact, what kind of term do we use for what happened in the Punjab in the 1980s and early 1990s? Is sometimes described as the Khalistan movement, but not every group people associated with the uprising talked about it in terms of creating a new state. Bhindranwale famously said he was neither for or against Khalistan. As many of the people with whom I talked in the Punjab pointed out to me, it was never unified. You have different groups with different agendas. So what to call it? I've been very loosely calling it an uprising to try to avoid the single term movement. And the term war, I think, applies only in terms of the attitude of the people who are involved, either for or against it. And I think there's no question that for many of the people who joined the struggle or supported it, they saw it in terms of an all or nothing absolutistic encounter, which is the definition of war. It was something that you either kill or be killed. You have to defend yourself. This is true of those who were opposed to it, as well as those people who were a part of it. Was it cosmic war, that is a metaphysical struggle? I think it's probably in the eyes of only some of the supporters, certainly not the ordinary foot soldiers, as Harish and Jagrup have pointed out in their wonderful study of young people who joined the movement. And I highly recommend that book to anyone interested, seriously interested in the uprising and what it consisted of. And what were the factors that led to its termination? So for most of the young people, they've joined out of maybe a spirit of battle, or because their friends were doing it, or just the excitement of the moment. And only for some was it a larger struggle in metaphysical, trans-historical terms. Bhindranwale very much saw it that way. I mean, he would put it in the context of Sikh history and the fight with the Mughals, and he would talk in terms of the great struggles of the past and how we are continuing today. For him, it was like Putin, who has recently put the Ukrainian war into metaphysical terms. That this is not just a struggle over territory, as Putin said just a week or so ago, but rather a struggle with the satanic West. And so he put it in the terms of the fight between good and evil, a position that Patriarch Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church has held now for quite a few months. So not everyone sees the struggle in those terms, but they often see it in terms of some kind of war. Well, then let's get to the situation in the Punjab. I pointed out that Bhindranwale was simply one voice. For a time, he was the most visible presence of the uprising and the symbol of it. And of course, that symbol in some ways came to an end, in some ways was enhanced in 1984 with Operation Blue Star, when Indira Gandhi took the advice of her generals that the way to end the movement was to end it by decapitating its leadership, and then the whole thing would fall apart. It was a tragic mistake, of course. It never quite worked. And it's true that Bhindranwale was holed up in the precincts of the Akal Takht, which you can see in the background, which is part of the larger compound of the Golden Temple. And he did have an armed camp. It was certainly a problem for her, but whether the whole movement could be ended so easily is another question. And of course, we all know what happened. It didn't end at all. And in fact, the movement grew enormously after this invasion of the Golden Temple. Yes, Bhindranwale was killed, but so was Mrs. Gandhi later the year by her own bodyguards. And then thousands of Sikhs who were attacked in just an orgy of violence following the assassination of Indira Gandhi, one of the saddest moments in recent Indian history, where the police and others participated in what was a vengeance against innocent Sikhs who had nothing to do with this, of course, but were identified as the enemy in kind of warlike terms. So this is a good example of what not to do. You can take a note to yourself if you're in a situation with violence and your generals come up with an idea, don't listen to them. It doesn't always work, and it certainly didn't work in this case. So I wanted to find out from as much as possible for the inside. To do the study, I did a lot of reading, I've read a lot of reports, but I also talked with some people. And the three people with me on the screen today, Mohinder, Jagrup, and Harish, were all very helpful in making some of these contacts. I also went to other places like Jalandhar and Hoshiarpur on other trips to the Punjab, and I talked with other people, but I'm going to focus on some of the conversations that I had with their help, including a remarkable discussion with Wasan Singh Zafarwal. And I remember back in the 80s, the name Zafarwal was, you know, his name was a part of one of the Khalistan commando groups. He was one of the leaders of a Panthic movement to try to combine forces of the different groups that were part of the uprising, which was unsuccessful, by the way. One of the things that Zafarwal was most bitter about. But to my surprise, he's still around. He's now returned. He went off to Pakistan and then to Switzerland, and now finally came back to India. He faced the government and kind of inconclusive in terms of the trial, but he's now able to live in his farm near Batala. And so remarkably, we could talk with him and get his story, not just his life story, but I was particularly interested in how the movement came to an end from his perspective. Was it crushed by the police? Was it a matter of bad leadership? But he had mentioned none of those things. For him, he thought about this question and then said it was the movement ended when the villages stopped supporting us. And when it's like the old adage of movements like this, guerrilla movements are like fish that need water. And when the water dries up, the fish die. So in his mind, when they lost support from the villages, and of course they lost support for a variety of reasons, including internal fights among the different groups, including a loss of faith in any kind of mission on the part of the young men who were the foot soldiers who became kind of roving gangs of thugs. But for Zafarwal, it's when the villagers stopped supporting them. So this division within the movement was one that was recounted to me on several occasions, including by people who are close to Binanwali. So that Binanwali himself often despaired about the infighting within the movement, even within the different groups who were sequestered within the precincts of the Golden Temple at the time he was there. And his own Sodhi, his own right-hand man, was killed probably by a rival group rather than by the Indian government, although it's still not exactly clear. So this infighting, this bitterness between the groups was as much of a factor as anything else. And then there is a perspective of the foot soldiers, the people out in the villages. This is a town near Amritsar where Jagrup and I went to talk with some of the people who were foot soldiers in the movement. And for them, it was as if the whole thing kind of fell apart. And one guy told us that he was afraid he couldn't leave because if he tried to escape, he might be killed by his own gang. But he really didn't see any way out, and he didn't see any reason for staying in. It was one of these kind of tragic dilemmas. And until finally he was able to give himself up to the police. And in his terms, his life really has never been on solid footing since. You know, he's been marked as a potential terrorist and somebody who is not privileged to a lot of the resources that other people are. And it's to me a terrible irony where the leaders of the movement, people like Simranjit Singh Man and Zaffarwal are doing quite well, and then some of the foot soldiers of the movement are still struggling, and they're still under the kind of punishment for being a part of a movement that they never quite understood while they were in it. It's one of those tragic situations. Well, KPS Gill had, of course, quite different perspective on how the movement came to an end. And through some Hinder's contacts, I was able to find people who could locate him. He was staying south of Delhi, near Mathura. And I was able to talk with him just a couple of months before he died. He was not in very good health when I talked with him. In fact, when I talked with him, he was, I had to compete with the television because he was watching the inauguration of Donald Trump as president of the United States. He was a big fan of Trump. And so he wanted to watch Fox News, but unfortunately it was not available in India. So he had to contend with CNN, but he was in rapt attention. But between the events of the inauguration, we did have a chance to talk a little bit. And he was absolutely unrepentant about his participation in the ending in the 1990s of the movement, as he saw it was a great success from his point of view. The very strong police methods, which he thought was solely responsible for crushing the movement. And he said he's been used as a model for how to deal with in counterterrorism, and he's been involved as a consultant in other parts of the world after what he and many others have regarded as his great success in terminating the movement. When I told him that a lot of people that I talked with who are part of the movement didn't even mention the police actions as one of the reasons why the movement came to an end, they said it had collapsed from within. It was, in some ways, it was dead before it was killed, if that makes any sense. He said, dismiss this. He said, no. He said they would just have fought on forever for no reason. He said they were fighting only for guns and glory. They had no other purpose. And as long as they had guns and they felt they had glory, they would have fought on. And it's possible he was right, at least to some extent. But in another extent, he simply performed a kind of coup de grace to a movement that had already become moribund, that already had collapsed from inside. Would it have lingered on if it wasn't for the very strong and harsh police measures that he brought in the 1900s? I don't know. I mean, he earlier tried to use these tactics and they didn't work, because while the movement was thriving, this kind of strong police response simply fueled the response of the people within the struggle. It made things worse. But in the 1990, by the time of 1993, 1994, the movement had already collapsed sufficiently from within. I use the word the movement, or I should say the movements, the groups, the uprising had collapsed from within. And so, yes, they were able to perform a kind of a final coup de grace. But it's uncertain whether it would have endured much long then, even if they had not intervened in such a harsh way. But the memories of their strong police intervention is still a kind of scar on the Punjab, and many people still resent it. So what's happened since? They've rebuilt Akal Takht. Can still go to the Golden Temple and see how beautifully the Akal Takht has been restored. This is not it, of course. It's on the other side of the bridge, but not just the Akal Takht. To my surprise, they've redone the whole front of the Golden Temple entryway. I remember in the old days when I came, you'd have to kind of fight your way down narrow lanes, and then finally you would get to to the entranceway of the Golden Temple. But now everything's been cleared out, and they have this huge courtyard, and it looks magnificent. There's a mall, a street with sculptures and shops where you have fast food and Gap clothing. It's really become a kind of Disneyland entrance. And so, is this a way to try to appease the sentiment of Sikhs in the Punjab and make them feel that, feel better about themselves? Can religious violence be appeased in this way? I don't know. But it's also true that in many ways, the grievances that started the movement in the first place have not been appeased. And you saw that in the Kisan Andolan within the last couple of years, one of the largest protest movements in history, where farmers from throughout North India, but particularly these same Jat Sikhs from the Punjab, rose up in protest against the government for some of the same kinds of reasons that were behind the uprising in the 1980s. So in that sense, the cause of the uprising and the problems associated with it certainly have not gone away, and are now being expressed in different ways. And so as long as the grievances, the concern, the feeling of being marginalized continues, the possibility of future uprisings also are part of our future. So at the end of my book, I try to bring together internal and external factors that conduce to the ending of movements. And you can see some of these exhibited in the uprising of the Punjab. Internal factors include a kind of loss of faith in whatever legitimacy and purpose that was involved in the movement, fractures, internal conflict, divisions among leadership. The most positive is new hope. And unfortunately, we've seen little of that in the Punjab. A lot of the young people now are on drugs. They still feel, as they did in the 1980s, that the future of rural Indian society is not as bright as it is for the for the more moneyed people within the cities. And so the hope that would change and transform a movement has not fully been delivered. External factors, of course, limitations, and this is where police and army can provide a role in showing the limit of what can be done in a civil society. But when you overdo that, when you come on like gangbusters, then it really is counterproductive. It leads to an increase of violence rather than a decrease. We saw that with the American war on terror as a response to 9/11. Which arguably led to more violence rather than violence. And then there's the positive aspects that can be provided externally: civil acceptance to the group, providing hope. And again, in the Punjab, the kind of promise for particularly the rural, rural people in the villages is not as strong as one would like. It's also true in the case of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Those conditions still are there. In those comparative study, the best case I found in terms of the government responding in a positive way was in the Philippines, where they have created a new Bangsamoro, a new political identity for the Muslim Moros of Mindanao, the southern island of the Philippines. And they've also set up training camps to try to provide for employment opportunities for people who are part of the guerrilla militia movements, to teach them skills that they could use in real life. So there are ways that a government can counter a situation like this in positive ways, but we haven't seen much of that in the case of the Punjab. So will the movement rise again, or a movement rise again? I don't know. Maybe not in the way it did before. Maybe the Kisan Andolan is the way in which an uprising will occur again in the future. And we'll have to wait and see. Well, those are my comments. I look forward to the discussion, and my colleagues may agree on some points, they may disagree on others, and I'm eager to hear what they have to say.
Thank you, Mark, for this presentation. Now I request Professor Puri to make his comments on your presentation. Professor Puri.
No, well, thank you. First of all, I want to emphasize that actually, whereas the title is How the Violence Ended in Punjab, it's clear that the reference is to what we passed through during the 1980s and up to the middle of 1990s. And those who have lived through it and have experienced that violence are obviously more concerned about learning how that violence emerged and how it ended. It did not end, certainly. In the minds of men, the justification of that violence continues. And perhaps at some moment, you never know, there may be another bout of it. But the point is that we need to go back and learn what went wrong where. The structural violence by the state just can never be ignored. The violence of the state was the crucial factor which led to this violence by the community, the leadership of the radicals in Sikh community in Punjab. And actually, it seems to me that when the problems arose, had the state been strong enough and prepared enough to confront and deal with that, perhaps such a situation would never have arisen. Right in 82, 83, you see a kind of mischievous kind of approach of people at the helm of affairs. It's now very widely known, the kind of tiff or rivalry between our Home Minister of the time and the Chief Minister of the time, and how this petty kind of personal prejudice and interests led to considerable escalation of differences, leading ultimately to violence. We remember that in 1979, after the 78 incident in Amritsar, concerning the Sant Nirankaris, which I think was again a failure of the state, and the Akali government was in power. If you had given the permission to the Sant Nirankaris to hold the conference, it was the state's duty to ensure that no such violence takes place, that there is security of life for everybody. And an absolute failure of the state at that point of time, which led to some 13 killings of 13 people at that point of time. So the responsibility of the state is one reason. And when Sant Bhindranwale emerged, you notice a virtual collapse of the state. When DIG Atwal, for example, lay murdered at the entrance to the Golden Temple. The people came from inside, killed him, and there were a number of people present there who were witnesses. And reportedly around the Golden Temple at that point of time, there were more than 100 police constables or policemen. Even his driver and security person. They simply fled. And what we notice is that for almost 2 hours, even the dead body of that DIG couldn't be lifted. The Deputy Commissioner, the SSP of Amritsar, just did not know how to respond to the situation. And they had to seek the permission of the Chief Minister whether they should enter the religious abode of God, Golden Temple, or not. There was quite a confusion in the minds of men whether this would be appropriate. So, which means the men on the spot just did not know how to respond, or they were so disabled by the state that they didn't have the courage to respond. So they wrote to ask the Chief Minister to give an order, and lo and behold, the Chief Minister himself did not feel that he had the courage to take a decision. And he rings up Mr. Alexander for getting the permission of the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister is not there. She's in Rajasthan. So it takes more than 2 hours. And the order which comes back is, no, you don't have to enter the Golden Temple. You don't have to pursue the killer. You don't have to arrest him. And you need to seek the permission of the SGPC to lift the dead body. I mean, such kind of collapse of the state, this became one big reason for a kind of a license acquired by those people who were obviously fighting against the state for their own reasons. There was a great justification, perhaps, in their own minds for fighting against the state, because they had allegation that the Sikh community has been not getting justice. There has been oppression. The Hindu state has been discriminatory against the Sikhs. Our rights have not been given, and we deserve our autonomy and maybe a separate state. Whatever, they had the right to protest. The question comes, at what point of time they cross the limit and take to violence to settle the score, not exactly hurting only the state apparatus, but the civilian people identified by them as enemies, whether it is Jagat Narayan or other people. Now, the point is that had the state been capable, both willing and capable, then at that point of time, it could have at least dealt with this kind of violence. And we may not have had the need to have Operation Blue Star. The question also is that hereafter, there's obviously greater legitimacy of the Sant and the followers who are carrying guns. And the community feels, yes, we have the right to have some kind of retributive justice as a punishment to the other community and the state. And lo and behold, the whole focus is on acquiring weapons. And the call is Shastari Bano, acquire weapons, and let the villages produce young men who have motorcycles and pistols, because that is required. Now, you see that perhaps there is not a clear-cut strategy. You only think of tactics of asserting your right and your sense of expressing your sense of anger. And see the emphasis on acquiring weapons, gun culture. Now that obviously is a matter of concern in a civil society when the just fondness and thrill of acquiring sophisticated weapons become part of accepted culture. You know, I recollect Shekhar Gupta, who was then the editor-in-chief of Indian Express. He, along with the editor of the Newsweek, went to meet Sant Bhindranwale in Guru Nanak Niwas. They sat on the floor, cross-legged, and Santji was sitting in a cot. And they had obviously questions and answers and discussions. And thereafter, that fellow, Edward Behr, was the editor of the Newsweek. When he tried to get up, he hobbled a little. And Santji asked Shekhar Gupta, Shekharji, what is he saying? And he translates, sir, he is saying that perhaps my foot went to sleep. And the Santji says, with a chuckle, it is not because his foot went to sleep, it is our Sten guns which have made him shiver with fear. Now, a leader of that caliber feels great when you have men with Sten guns around, as if with these 10 guns you can take on the state. Now, this culture.
Puri, Puri, I think, you have made conclude with the, you have made the very valid points. I think now give us a concluding comment.
Okay. My point is that number one, we see the failure of the state repeatedly. The whole terribly messy affair of what we call the Operation Blue Star. And even Major General Kuldeep Singh actually clearly admitted that actually we did not know what kind of fortification and mining was there. That this can happen, that the SGPC and the Akal Takht managers, jathedars, were totally disabled, and they allowed fortification of the Golden Temple, the most sacred. When in a most sacred religious place, those who have the duty to manage the affairs, if they are threatened to the extent that somebody, just because they have more weapons, they could coerce and go into the Akal Takht. This certainly is not a question merely for the state, it's a question for the society. Those who are truly dedicated, devoted Sikhs, they felt that it's the gun which has taken over. And when the state organizes Operation Blue Star, it's such a messy, clumsy affair. You don't know how to excuse the state and what kind of state was it. The point is that the failures of state, the incompetence of state, and also the kind of, subtle kind of violence of variety of kinds of the state has created a situation in which you have what Mark called foot soldiers, jumping in, and just because of the lust for weapons, the thrill of the weapons. And they have, whether it's in killings or extortions or kidnappings or all kinds of exploits, making the life of the common people in the village so scary. I remember in Amritsar the kind of life we lived during the
I think I think that's Puri. If I add, 2 points, which you have.
Let me just say that if I have to, totally referring to this violence in Punjab specific, if I have to see at what point of time do we see a turnaround, then perhaps the beginning could be traced to the Operation Black Thunder 2, whereby on the one hand, the legitimacy or the high moral ground which the leaders enjoyed because they were taking on the state for the interest of the community, that kind of moral ground was lost. And until that point of time, they thought the safest sanctuary is the Golden Temple itself. When that safe sanctuary was lost after Operation Black Thunder, then they had to run around in the villages, and the point came when even the villagers refused to host them during the night, and that became the perfect reason for them to learn that now we have lost the trust of the common people. And that became the reason. And now the state also, after all, the leadership relationship matters. The Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, the Chief Minister Singh, DGP KPS Gill, that they had for the first time after a very long time, this kind of interrelationship, a kind of a sync, kind of a fit that, all right, go ahead. And we know the price which people had to pay even for this. The massive sort of fake encounters, people were simply picked up and it created a huge human rights violation situation. Yet the people who lived there in Punjab and the people who resisted, like the CPI, CPM, all popular resistance was there against it. They at least felt, thank God, there is a little bit of return of peace. And we can't ignore this point.
I think, First Puri, you have made concluding remarks, 2 very valid points. You have built up a continuum where you have mentioned that the manifest form of violence is shaped by opportunistic character of politics, underground economic activities, excessive reliance on repressive state apparatus, and above all, on the external support. And there you moved on to highlight how the consensus against terrorism was built within the polity, and that ultimately weakened, the manifest form of violence. And the second point which you have made, that how the militants also lost some kind of legitimacy with the masses, because the kind of number of Panthi codes they introduced, dress code for the children, teaching code for the teachers, language code, medical, industrial, water, election, all on all these spheres, they issued the code of conduct. But the moment they issued a code of conduct for the patriarch, so long they were confining to women that they should not wear this dress and that those kind of things they should not do. The moment they said the village patriarch will not drink, have liquor, will not, decide who will marry whom, they questioned the village authority itself. And that was also the reason that how the terrorists lost some kind of legitimacy with the people. You have made these two very crucial points. I think that this is a good contribution. Now I request Jagrup, Sekhon. Professor Puri has covered lots of domain. So is Mark, and Jagrup has to find his way. And I think 7 minutes will be sufficient for him to make some crucial points. We are approaching dinner time. Jagrup.
Thank you, Professor Pramod. I think nothing is left to say, as Professor Mark and Professor Puri has covered almost all the areas. But having said all these things, I think there is need to look into, I'm focusing only on that, the topic which has been given to us, how the violence came to an end. Me and Mark both met to Jaffrewal. I again met to the Jaffrewal. After that, I met more than a dozen the ex-warriors. And this was the question to all of these people, that we have many explanations of the rise of the terrorist violence in the state, but we do not have basically the way terrorism or the way violence disappeared from the scene. Nobody even imagined. You see that when Ribeiro joined as a DGP of Punjab, the very first day there was an encounter in Kapurthala in which some policemen and the terrorists were killed. Then he gave a statement must be there on the newspaper, that the people of the Punjab must learn to live in this situation, because once the terrorism comes, hardly it disappears. Might not be basically aware about the structure and all these things, particularly the Punjab specific things. Basically, the decline of the terrorism starts with what Dr. Pramod has referred to. 1987, when the so-called Code of Conduct and the social reform movement was imposed before the dismissal of Surjit Singh Barnala Ministry. I think it is not only the state, basically the state actors, particularly the political actors, are equally rather more than responsible to create the situation where the people of the Punjab suffered a lot. People of not only the Punjab, but the country as a whole has suffered a lot. Basically, that gave an opportunity. We all know that all we have worked, was a lot of material on all these things over there. There was a mushroom growth of the terrorist organization. We have a 2 to 3 terrorist organizations till 1984. Nobody had heard about anything. After that, we see that we have 13 terrorist organizations and dozens of the groups among the terrorist organizations. It became free for all. And who joined? In our own study, that what was the ideology of the people who joined terrorism? What was the profile of the terrorist? What was the agenda of the terrorist? I think a very insignificant number, those who talked about the Khalistan. Rest, basically, that situation provided an opportunity. The central government did not go by the accord which was enacted between the Rajiv Gandhi and the Longowal. And you know that even after Operation Blue Star, we had a very peaceful election in 1985. When the first time it was the Akali government came into being, and we have not seen the violence over there. After that, there was basically targeted killings. Before 1985, it was only the 1987 which provided this social conduct or a movement, provided an opportunity or the legitimacy that Pramod has rightly said, or Puri has also referred to that, give the legitimacy to all these activities. And who became the victim of this violence? You see, 1988, 89, 90, and the 91, there was the maximum killing from the both sides. And who became the victim? More generally, the people of Punjab, and more specifically the Sikhs. And among the Sikhs, it was Jat Sikhs, who at one point of time considered to be the supporter of this ideology, or you can call it it's a movement in that way, also a situation. They became the victim of that. When it became free for all, And ultimately, one thing which I think has not taken into consideration, state structure is there. State structure had got strengthened. KPS Gill was earlier there as a DGP. But it was a situation which was created because of the people's non-cooperation system, the support. There was involuntary migration. The well-to-do people moved from the rural area to the urban areas. Terrorism became a business. We have many instances where within an hour, lakhs of rupees were basically, and all other things were there in that way also. So to sum up in that way also, it's the people of the Punjab who ultimately stood against these terrorists or this movement, and ultimately became what we see that the central point of the decline of the terrorism. There are various other reasons there. Resistance from below was also there. But my point here is that when the people became the victim of this situation, all those basically what we that misdeeds, they have suffered a lot. If you allow me, Dr. Pramod, I will just read. I one study of that a large number of people were kidnapped by the terrorists.
Yes.
And they remained with the terrorists from almost an average of 12 to 13 days. They were basically the ones who saw them very close quarters. We are also victims of terrorism. And let me confess in that way also, we use the terrorists to neutralize the assault of the other terrorist groups. That was the situation over there. Factional fight was there. All these things were there. Basically, their character, their behavior, their response, their treatment to the people who at one point of time considered to be their sympathizer, considered to be what we see that helping them. So when they became the victim of that, they started withdrawing and passing information to the police. So what there's 3-4 lines. Basically, I'm talking about those who who were kidnapped by the terrorists. They remained with them for 3 hours to 19 days. It's basically total sum of that. These victims had interacted with the terrorists from a very close quarters. We asked them to give their general perception about the terrorists, though they may not be very objective in their opinions because of their personal experiences and suffering. But the available data of our earlier study established their viewpoint. Out of a very few terrorists who were found mannered and courteous in their behavior with the victim and the families where they used to stay and dine with them, the rest were basically what we see that what we see is not in that way. Just one. The situation was totally different in other cases where the terrorists used violence against their victims with the imagined position of power. The victims during their captivity did not see them reciting anything religious, Gurbani sort of thing. A large number of them were clean-shaven or had trimmed beard. The leaders of these groups usually used very abusive language, not only against the victim, but also against their fellow terrorists. The victim noticed criminal streaks in their behavior of these terrorists, and a few of them were seen consuming all these things which are banned in that situation. So my point here is that basically those who were what we supposed fighter for that, their response toward the people over there ultimately provided a state. And of course, it's right in that we also, once B.R. Singh came into power, he gave a political shield. Otherwise, before that, the security forces were under the direct attack of the opposition parties and all other organizations over there. Once B.R. Singh came over there, he took that responsibility and gave a free hand. We know that there was a large-scale human rights violations. On both sides, the majority basically, on the police side, it was again that the same community was there. On the other side, the majority of the population belonged to the same community. And ultimately, most of the cases, the common people or the basically what innocent people became the victim of that. People started realizing that the whole problem is there.
I think that you have made two very valid points. That on the one hand, you have tried to establish that within the state there was a consensus against terrorism was built. The consensus against terrorism across political parties was evolved or forced, maybe through boycotting of the election by the Akalis. Then you have a consensus because there was no threat to the legislative power of the Congress party. So therefore, some kind of consensus against terrorism was built, and state used excessive force to eliminate the terrorists. Very valid point. And the second point, I mean, which you, on the other hand, you mentioned that amongst the militants became fragmented. There was no consensus for any particular cause which existed at that time. So therefore, a fragmented terrorist movement and a consensus-oriented state could control the fragmented assertions by individual terrorists. And the second point, I mean, related to this, is the threat and need paradox of democracy, that the institutions, the political parties which earlier used to be threatened by the same institution which gives them the power, they demolished it. But having demolished those institutions, they became powerless. And then they, in the process, started reviving it. And you remember in 92, when the election was held, and some of us wrote that democracy, the only antidote to terrorism. We were, I mean, and Professor Puri also signed, and many of us, I mean, signed that document. And many people, even Satyapal Dang, wrote in the Tribune in response to my article that Pramod doesn't understand politics and he doesn't understand political science also, when he's saying the election to the state assembly should be held, because the moment the election will be there, the people will win and declare Khalistan. So he was of that opinion. But we have been consistently fought for this, that democracy, the only antidote to terrorism. And that is why the revival of democracy is another factor which eliminated some form of violence from the state structure. The violent state structure, and KPS Gill, the role in this sense becomes little crucial because he took the police back to the barracks. He didn't assert to continue to wield power beyond a particular point. Normally, I mean, the people, I mean, those who capture all the power, because the state bureaucracy was defunct, judiciary was non-functional, the political leadership was in their ghettos, and here was person enjoying all the power, but and slowly, steadily, he surrendered that power, maybe under pressure or maybe under some kind of thinking which he had. So election to the state assembly were held, and then Akalis didn't participate. Voting percentage was very low. Intelligently, then the state held the election for panchayat and municipalities, so that the democracy starts, I mean, functioning. So therefore, I mean, I think, I mean, these are the very valid points, I mean, which has come out of, I mean, this discussion. And I think that if there is any questions, we can have another session because dinner time has approached. Now I request Mohinder ji to conclude and say whatever, I mean, he wants to take us wherever for dinner.
I don't know whether Mark interviewed KPS Gill, whether Gill agrees with Pramod's presumptions. Mark, any comment? He suddenly decided to withdraw from powerful position. Was he forced, or maybe his conscience asked him to stop? What happened?
No, I wish Professor Pramod Kumar had been with me to ask those questions, but my general approach was to let people talk. Let me just say a word in response to both Harish and Jagrup's comments, and you can see why I've learned so much from both of them and how much I have appreciated their comments and their insights and their rich knowledge of the Punjab. It's been just invaluable. And I also agree with all of their points. The issue of state response. When the state regards a militancy as war, then this in fact produces war. I mean, the number of the people with whom I've talked said that they got involved because of the actions of the police, or because the police killed a friend of theirs, and that they saw this lawlessness from the part of the police as a reason for them to engage in the struggle. So it is an overabundance of violence from the police side can be enormously counterproductive. Saw this in the case of Northern Ireland, where the British tried to end the uprising at the outset by coming in like gangbusters and killing people, and this really started the whole movement. It was in response to this that the movement developed. And I've seen that in my own country, where peaceful protests are countered by militarized police, which really then incite the violence. So these points are very well taken. And if the state had responded differently from the very beginning, as Harish said, beginning with the Nirvinkari incident, maybe things would have been vastly different.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
I have a small question for Pramod, because he's intellectual as well as a field worker. Now, the way things are developing in Punjab, this Amritpal and others, can we sort of somehow hope that state will be able to control it?
I think
There are a lot of fears.
It's a very tricky question, because a person, I mean, comes from all the way from Dubai, and he is launched into the political domain with all kinds of statements which he is making. I think the state must have some role, and they will think that they will be able to control him the way they thought they will be able to control Bhindranwale. So I think, I mean, these kind of errors the states do commit, and historically they have been committing these errors. And I consider this may be another error. It is in their right to commit such errors. Otherwise, state will not be known as state, which is a platonic, perfect state. It is a state which commits follies and has been doing it historically, will continue to do it in future also. And it is for the citizens and the people, and people those who fight for democratic rights and also peace for Punjab. They should keep on, I mean, having a struggle against such kind of implantations. I will not say plantation, plants grow in the organic soil. Implant can produce tragedies, but if people are alert, people know the consequences, people have experienced it already, perhaps they may not succeed. It's hope. And let's hope. Puri.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, since you have talked about this man Amritpal, how he has been brought from Dubai, we remember that actually, first of all, it was Jagjit Singh Chauhan, who reportedly by now, financed by some Pakistani agency, put out that half-a-page advertisement in the New York Times.
That's right.
Jagjit Singh Chauhan, Sohan Singh, who was of the Panthik committee, or Ganga Singh Dhillon, who was brought here. Who were they? Who brought them? And unless, as Professor Kumar has said, unless we think that there has to be alternative provided for resolution of the problems, alternative to violence, short of violence, everything should be permitted. Whether it's propaganda,
yes.
Amritpal talks about anything, let him talk about it. We don't want that he should take to violence or organize violence. That should be the bar. And depends whether the state can respond effectively to that, or once again commits the same kind of mistakes in this case.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I noticed one disturbing trend. Pramod talked about 3 Punjabs. One Punjab is there, but our Punjab on the other side has been source of trouble for us. And same the diasporic Punjab, I think now we need to create awakening in this Punjab, you know, for their faults who suffer, especially people in Delhi like me, who are always fighting against terrorism and who suffered the most. Those who did loose talk in Punjab, they enjoyed. So this is, I think we have to build some sort of public resistance or awareness that they should mind their own business. I mean, referendum, then what? Let them make a Khalistan and Canada. I don't mind.
Yeah, and even in England, also, you should not mind even that.
Yeah, that I don't mind. Yeah, they should not disturb our Punjab at least. That's my wish. Anyway.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's great.
Thank you, Mark, for your presentation. Of course, I have read your books, so you know, and the kind of studies you have made for you know, Philippines and ISIS, and you have a broader idea of, you know, when idea of a religious sort of divinely ordained kind of a future, you build illusions, how people are prepared to die for a cause and kill for a cause. Learning from that experience and how all those sort of you know, incidents of violence ultimately ended, that certainly is helpful in learning about how do we deal with such situations?
Thank you very much.
Friends,
Thank
let
you.
me thank you again.
Yeah.
Especially Mark, he got up, I think, early morning, like a good sick at 7 a.m., isn't it?
Yes.
And Pramod, I was really impressed the way you conducted that function on the release of Ramesh in this book. Frank, outright, and last minute request to Professor Puri and Jagrup Singh, they said yes. We're all thankful to them. And we're also thankful to the audience who has joined us online. This online business is really helping because people from outside, they join and listen. And after the function, again, they can keep on listening. My only prayer is that we should learn from the past. Do not repeat the mistakes. Thank you very much again for joining us.